Welcome to part 2 of our lecture on the cell. In part 1, we looked over the functions of cells, and then we're starting to look at the regions of the cell. We have the membrane, we have the nucleus with its nucleolus, and we have cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is mostly water. And the outside of the cell is mostly water too, but the cell needs to keep the outsides out and the insides in. It's not the same water apparently. So the cell membrane acts as a barrier to keep the insides in, the outsides out. Now if we took the section of it, made up of phospholipids mostly. Phospholipids that look like double-tailed sperm make up 75% of the lipids. Now the tails, I'm pretty sure they don't all have two tails. Now we have another lipid called cholesterol in there. And I am not drawing the ring structure in cholesterol, but cholesterol is found all throughout the cell membrane, and its job is to keep the cell membrane rigid. And our third one, I'll just modify this phospholipid, and I'll put Bob. Those are glycolipids, and they ID. So this guy is saying, my name's Bob. That's a good identification. Now, the other component is proteins. And the proteins let the cell interact with neighboring cells. They help transport things in. So back to our phospholipids, they form a barrier. That barrier keeps the interstitial fluid inside, and it keeps extracellular fluid outside. And because it's lipid, this is hydrophobic in here, stuff in this fluid like sodium or potassium cannot pass through, or charge things like carbohydrates. Glucose is supposed to be in the cell, but it can't get across from the outside unless it gets transported through a protein. So proteins are an important part of the cell. The lipid component keeps it together, that's the cholesterol, and forms a barrier. These proteins are actually going to let things through, like glucose, or sodium, or potassium. Where we left off on the slides, phospholipids are the majority lipid, and they form a barrier. They don't let sodium into the cell. It goes, nope, I'm out of here. It does not let potassium escape. Cholesterol is the second most common one. These are cholesterol molecules, and they help keep it rigid. It keeps it from falling apart. And then glycolipids are identification markers. And again, don't memorize the actual percentages. Now, there are three kinds of proteins that are found in the cell membrane. Protein here and this protein here, they go through the cell, so they are called transmembrane or integral. It's two textbooks at DVC. I believe one of them calls it integral, one of it calls it transmembrane, and I am not sure which book is which. Now, other ones are on the periphery. They're on one side or the other. So this and this would be peripheral proteins. So a peripheral protein is only on one side. So this is only on one side. It could be holding the cytoskeleton together. This one right here could be holding it onto the next cell. This peripheral protein could be an enzyme. So people that are lactose intolerant, they lack an enzyme, we'll call it that digests milk sugar, which is lactose. That's found on the outside of cells. Integral or transmembrane, trans means across, go all the way through. So this is a transmembrane protein. This could be a glucose channel to let glucose in through the cell. It could be a receptor, so these could be receptors. And then we have glycoproteins, and like the glycolipids, they ID the cells, and they actually help bind them to neighbors. We'll talk about that, I believe, in the tissue chapter. These are some examples of what they do, not on test. So transport, that would be a transmembrane protein like this. So we have transport. It lets things cross. They can be receptors. They too tend to be transmembrane proteins. Oh, look, insulin is binding. And it's causing, actually, the glucose channels to open to let glucose in. It could be anchorage. We're going to talk about anchoraging in the next chapter on tissue. But basically, cells are anchored or attached to each other. Now, they also anchor the cytoskeleton. Cell recognition, remember the glycolipids and glycoproteins? That helps the cells talk to each other. And there's actually this protein called major histocompatibility complex 1. And that actually is part of your immune system. It lets your white blood cells recognize the cell as belonging and doing the right thing. The fun fact about that protein is that if you kiss somebody whose major histocompatibility complex protein is vastly different from you, you get fireworks when you kiss them. It's a really good kiss. When you kiss your brother or sister, it's bleh, because you have the same major histocompatibility complex proteins. So again, we're not worrying about that. I just thought I'd gross you out by talking about kissing your brother and sister. Junctions and enzymes. So that was why I was talking lactose intolerant. You don't have the enzyme. You can't digest milk sugar. So, which is the major lipid on the cell membrane? You saw this question coming, right? Well, that's not a lipid. That's not a lipid. Cholesterol is a lipid. It's actually a sterol. But that's about 20%. So that, nope. Phospholipids. And what do they make? They're a barrier. Remember what carbohydrate, or do you remember what cholesterol does? That's rigid. And proteins let things in. So, a protein that goes all the way through is a integral or transmembrane protein, peripheral protein. We haven't heard about G proteins yet. Transmorphic proteins, I swear whoever wrote that's making things up now. So, periphery is on the outside, so it would be integral or transmembrane. So, we're going to talk about the cytoplasm and the organelles. Now, the cytoplasm is what is all the fluid portion of the cell membrane and all the organelles found in it. The fluid portion is called cytosol. It is mostly water and other dissolved substances like potassium, glucose, and it's actually glucose 6-phosphate, by then some other things that dissolve, and organelles. Those are the functional parts of the cell. Organelles means little itty-bitty baby organs. And they're the assembly line inside your cell. They are doing things. Each one has a specific function. Absence of, a great way to spell check is to put it online, an organelle means a cell cannot do anything. So on tests, I like destroying mitochondria. What does mitochondria do? Make energy, so the cell can't make energy. Or your nerve cells lack centrioles, so whatever the centriole lets a cell do, a nerve cell can't do. So we'll look at this a couple times in this lecture. Now there's two flavors, membrane-bound organelle. They have this membrane that looks like double-tailed sperm. This is the phospholipid membrane. And what was the job of the phospholipids? Wait a second. This looks like the phospholipid membrane. And what was the job of the phospholipids? Keep the outside out and the inside in. They're busy doing things like making toxic substances, dissolving toxic substances, making things that won't dissolve in water, and so forth. Then we have non-membrane bound organelles. So, non-membrane bound. They are in direct contact with the cytoplasm. And there's 3 of them. So here's our cell. Here's our nucleus. And ribosomes are fun to make. They're my ribosomes. Now, these are going to make proteins that stay in the cell. So ribosomes, the free ones, make enzymes, or they make things that stay in the cell. In physiology, you'll learn about glycolysis. That's breaking sugar down into something usable. And there's 10 enzymes. You may or may not get to memorize them. And since that's all happening in the cytoplasm, those are free enzymes are made at free ribosomes. The cytoskeleton holds the shape of the cell. So we're going to learn next class, you have some cells that are roughly cube-shaped. You have some cells that are roughly rectangular, but three-dimensional rectangles. That is so not a rectangle. And some that look like space aliens that are very angry at you. The cytoskeleton holds the space alien shape as a space alien, the cube as a cube. The rectangle, apparently the cytoskeleton failed miserably on that one. And then centrioles. They aid in cell division. Wait, didn't I say the neuron, that's our space alien, lacks centrioles? That means these nerve cells can't divide. Poor nerve cell. So, membrane-bound organelles. I'm assuming you had this in high school biology, so I'm not going to spend that much time on them. And we'll look at what they actually look like in lab, so I'm not going to really draw them here either. So our membrane-bound organelles have a phospholipid bilayer that keeps the outside out, the inside in. Why? Well, let's look at our mitochondria right here, girl in red. And the mitochondria makes hydrogen peroxide. What do you use hydrogen peroxide for? Well, if this was still the 80s, you'd say dye your hair. But you use it for cleaning, I believe, and disinfecting. Hydrogen peroxide kills cells. You don't want that escaping the mitochondria. You have some making cholesterol. Well, cholesterol is a fat. You don't want that in cytoplasm. So it's doing something that's either toxic or you want to separate it. Now, there are 5 membrane-bound organelles. I expect you to know what they do on the test. And the first one is endo, inside, plasmic reticulum. I'm going to draw it. So the endoplasmic reticulum comes off continuous. Oh my goodness, I just drew a TIE fighter. So, some of this endoplasmic reticulum is going to have ribosomes. Do you remember what ribosomes made? Yes, they make proteins. So this is going to make proteins, but these proteins need to be isolated from down here. So these proteins are going to be either incorporated into the cell membrane. Remember, there's membranes in the cell membrane, proteins in the cell membrane, or they're going to leave the cell. Now, the other part is smooth. So we'll talk about the 2 flavors next. Now, this is going to make proteins. That protein has to be packaged. So it's going to be packaged into something called the Golgi complex. Endoplasmic reticulum is going to make proteins. This packages them. Now, this all takes a lot of energy. So we're going to have mitochondria. Mitochondria actually have 2 membranes, and they make energy. So here are our membrane-bound organelles. We have the rough ER that makes proteins that will leave the cell, are toxic to the cell, or will be in the cell membrane. The Golgi complex will package them because we can't let these proteins loose in the cell. The mitochondria makes energy for everything. 2 other organelles that are membrane-bound. The first is a lysosome. It has enzymes that digest things. In programmed cell death, the lysosomes are open and the cell digests itself from inside. So yeah, you don't want to mix the lysosome with everything around it. Then the peroxisome, that detoxifies things. It has toxic waste in it. You do not want that floating around either. So on the test, you need to know what the membrane-bound and non-membrane-bound organelles are and what they do. And we will talk about the endoplasmic reticulum in our next video.